Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Steve Elliott and this is the lecture titled Introduction to Assessment. I have 28 slides and some will go pretty quickly, others will stop and pause to think about things, but also accompanying this lecture are a couple of readings and a chapter, as well as some reflections and discussion board assignments. So please follow the directions posted on Blackboard in terms of what other work you have to do in addition to just watching and listening to this lecture, which is only a part of the content for this module. So the purpose of this module is to introduce the concept of assessment in health and physical education, and it takes a pretty broad view of what assessment is, introduces some ideas on why we should assess and some misconceptions about assessment, and then gets into some definitions and some specific examples of the types of assessment. So this is kind of foundational knowledge in terms of assessment, so we can build on this as we move through the course. Again, please pay attention on Blackboard to the assignments that accompany this lecture. So, this is always a good question to ask when we're starting to talk about assessment. When you hear the word assessment, what do you think about? And obviously we can't have a discussion about that as you're watching it, but just think in your mind, when you hear the term, oh, you have to assess in physical education, what is it that you're automatically thinking about? Is it something that generally excites you? Or is it something that you think about might represent some work that you're not that excited about? So for a lot of people, the term assessment in health and physical education is relatively new. It's not something that comes naturally, because I think as teachers we just want to plan activities and we want to teach those activities, and then we want to move on to our next lessons, our next units, and we really don't want to take time to assess whether students actually learned anything in the activities and the lessons we just did. So it's not something that comes naturally, and it's something that's actually probably been forced upon us by some changes in the profession and in the educational landscape in terms of the education reform movement and having to prove that our students are learning things. So this started about 20-25 years ago in some of the other subject areas, and has developed rapidly, so it's now pervasive in all the academic subject areas. No longer can we just say, yes, we think our children are learning because we watch them. We now have to prove that our students are learning through the use of different types of assessment. So I don't want you to be too intimidated by the term assessment. I understand it's probably not the most exciting topic to talk about, but if you're going to be an effective physical education and health teacher, then there's no doubt about it, you're going to have to be, you're going to have to think like an assessor, as the book chapter talks about in its opening. So there's lots of reasons why we should assess, and I've pulled some of these off from the references listed on the back of this PowerPoint. And we'll go through some of these. Some of them I'll just read off. They're pretty self-explanatory. Others I'll go a little bit deeper into. So why should we assess? High stakes testing is forcing administrators to look at non-core subjects such as physical education as targets for budget cuts, sacrificing physical activity opportunities for our children. So as principals and school districts and teachers are being assessed on how well their kids perform on these high stakes end of grade testing, it's moved them to put more time into those core subject areas and taken away times from physical education. Now that's actually probably a 10-year-old phenomenon or trend. We can kind of see it moving back in the other direction more recently. In a strange way, the obesity epidemic has been good for our profession because it's made states realize that they need to provide more physical activity opportunities for children, and that legislation such as the No Child Left Behind Act, which did cut physical education from schools indirectly, has led to our children being less physically active and less fit. And when you couple that with the amazing amount of research that shows that our fittest children are performing most successfully in schools, that's why some school districts have moved towards more physical education minutes per week. Unfortunately, North Carolina is a little bit behind in that movement, in that trend, but there's lots of states in our region and nationally that have moved back towards more physical education per week. Research has indicated that physical education in public schools has demonstrated a lack of ability to assess its outcomes. So as a profession, our reputation, and this is backed up by research, is that we're not very good at assessing. We know that assessment plays a vital role in educational reform. We know that district and state levels is being used to evaluate schools and subject areas. And research provides credibility of subject areas and academic discipline. So it's incumbent on us as good professionals in the field of physical education and health to assess, to show that we're meeting our goals in terms of program goals and that our students are also learning the content that we say they're learning. Other reasons we should assess: there's been content standards, also known as national standards, developed by NASPE, and NASPE is the National Association for Sport and Physical Education, which is under the Shape America umbrella. Shape America was formerly known as APHED, and they've produced lots of documents that guide us on assessment techniques. Assessment causes us to think about how we determine if students have learned the content we want them to learn. So obviously one purpose of assessment and why we should be doing it is it allows us to see if students are learning. It can inform us on the feedback that we provide to students in terms of their progress. It can motivate students to help improve their performance. Assessment can allow the instructor to adjust their planning and their instructions if objectives have not been met. Assessment can help us evaluate the entire PE program to see if students are meeting goals, and in turn if the PE program is meeting its goals and missions and values. And then at a lower level, assessment can be used to help us place students into groups. We can use this assessment data to group students in different ways, and then also it can be used for grading purposes. Note that grading purposes was the last bullet on these 2 or 3 slides on why we should assess. Yes, assessment can be used for grading, but assessment shouldn't just be done for grading purposes, and we'll talk a lot about that in our upcoming modules. So when we think about what is learning, I think that the chapter presents a couple of good paragraphs to lead us here, and I'm going to read a little bit of it and then we'll discuss it. Learning in physical education is complicated. Unlike the academic subject areas such as history, math, and science that focus primarily on cognitive learning, physical education occurs in 3 different domains of learning, and these domains are important especially for Praxis 2 purposes. Our primary learning domain is psychomotor, which involves movement, skills, and fitness. However, the psychomotor domain is very much influenced by the affective domain, largely because of the influence of student effort in learning motor skills. Many physical educators believe the affective domain is just as important as the psychomotor because our students must learn to value physical activity in order to maintain lifelong health and wellness. And last but not least, the cognitive domain works hand in hand with the psychomotor domain. Research by Lee reveals that when people are learning motor skills, they learn best when they think about the movement process. So when we think about learning, I want you to really consider those 3 domains of learning: psychomotor, affective, and cognitive, and how we can assess learning within each 3 of those domains. This is important because the national standards and the North Carolina essential standards, which we'll talk about later in this course, are separated into these 3 domains of learning. And as you can see from the schedule of this course, when we get towards the second half of the course, I actually do break some of the modules down to look at those 3 different domains. There's several misconceptions about assessment, and let's look at these individually. And if we were in class, I might ask you to explain why you think they're misconceptions. So as I'm presenting each one of these, maybe be thinking about why are these misconceptions? What's happening in the real world that makes that so? Pre-tests, which we'll talk about later, are always written tests. They don't have to be. Assessment is the same thing as grading. Absolutely it's not. Learning can be assessed only with a written test. Baloney. Only the athletes can learn in physical education. Well, that's just ridiculous. Physical educators can accurately assess the amount of effort their students expend. That's tricky. Assessment takes unnecessary time away from teaching and activity. We'll talk about how you can combine assessment through alternative and authentic means so that it's combined with your teaching and doesn't reduce the physical activity your students engage in. Another misconception is that physical education teachers don't need to write down assessment stuff because they can just see whether their students are learning. Well, that's just not going to fly in this modern day. It's not fair to assess motor skills because not all students are athletic. That is also a misconception because our job is to take students from where they are and move them forwards. Observation is a type of assessment. Well, it can be a way to assess, but it's not going to be the be-all and end-all. You can't assess the skill level of lower skilled children because these students don't try. And accountability is always punitive. So there's some misconceptions I think we'll cycle back around several times in this course and discuss. So there's many purposes of assessment, and I want to just focus on page 5 in the scan chapter 1 that talks about assessment for learning and assessment of learning. So assessment has changed a great deal over the past several decades, and it's reflected in NASB's statement, who say that the primary goal of assessment should be seen as the enhancement of learning rather than simply the documentation of learning. We now see that assessment is intertwined with the learning process and is not separate from teaching. It serves 2 primary purposes in all school subjects, including physical education. Firstly, assessment for learning. These ongoing assessments help students learn by providing feedback that leads to goal setting and improvement. They also help you adjust instruction to meet students' needs. Assessment of learning. These assessments are used for grading. They are final because there is no chance for the teacher to adjust or for learners to improve. So there's the difference for learning and of learning. Some important definitions for us. Assessment, we're going to define it as the measurement or collection of information regarding student performance of skills, knowledge, and attitudes. And again there, if you look closely, you can see psychomotor, skills, cognitive, knowledge, and affective, attitudes. You can see those 3 domains in that statement. Evaluation is the process of using the assessment information to make a judgment on student performance. And then grading is the composite score that incorporates the information and data gained through assessment and evaluation. So you're going to have to read that a couple of times to catch the differences between those 3 things. But it's very important that we don't just think we're talking about grading. We will talk about how to use assessment and evaluation for grading, but we're not just talking about how to apply students' grades through the use of assessment. Formative assessment occurs during the unit. It's ongoing. The purpose is to find out what students are learning, and it can be used in some kind of grading or test. Summative evaluation, and the key word here is sum. The assessment occurs at the end of the unit, or the sum of. It's built into the unit in order to help students change their behavior while they're engaged, and it can help teachers evaluate instructional practices. we see formative and summative assessments in all education areas. Formative assessment has become more trendy and more popular because it allows us to give feedback during the unit and for students to make changes based on that feedback. Summative evaluation are those kind of end of semester tests or any kind of final evaluation where learners don't get a chance really to take that into account and make changes. Traditional assessments are definitely becoming more popular, and every conference I go to, there's several presentations on traditional versus non-traditional or alternative assessments. So traditional assessments include written tests, fitness tests, skills tests, and surveys. Now, there's definitely a place for these, and they're popular, although the movement towards alternative assessment, authentic assessment, is meaning we see fewer and fewer of these types of assessments. So let's talk about authentic or alternative assessments, and we'll go ahead and use those two terms interchangeably. These are also sometimes called standards-based assessment. They are tasks that are meaningful and simulate real-world tasks, and we'll talk more about these later in the course. And if we come up with authentic assessments or alternative assessments, we generally have to create criteria used to how we're going to assess those tasks. For example, if we're going to create an authentic assessment in a health class where we ask the students to produce a skit in groups of 3 where they demonstrate 5 ways to resist peer pressure, then we're going to have to assess that assessment. So we have to create a rubric to assess how students design and perform that skit and whether they demonstrate knowledge of peer pressure techniques that we're asking them to apply in that activity. Another example might be if we have the students create a poster that shows the dangers of nicotine and tobacco. Rather than just giving them a written test where we say which one of these are the dangers of smoking, we ask them to produce something, and most authentic assessments involve student production of something where they produce a poster that they hang up in the hallways, and we'd have to come up with some kind of rubric or checklist where we could grade that poster, and we'll talk more about that later in the course too. Another big example is the game performance assessment instrument that actually allows us to assess students' performance while playing in a game, usually a small-sided, developmentally appropriate version of a game. Pre and post assessment, also known as value-added instruction, has become very popular in any educational subject matter, mainly because it allows you to show that students might have improved as a result of your instruction. So generally, you want to give a pre-test and post-test that are the same, and then in the middle of that do lots of instruction and lots of practice time, repetitions, and then at the end to see if any student learning has taken place. There's a couple of problems here. Firstly, we get into this concept of teaching to the test. Secondly, motor learning experts will tell you that you're not really measuring learning, you're measuring performance effects. And to measure learning, there's only really 2 ways to do that. Those are through a retention test, where you measure their performance a couple of weeks later, or through a transfer test, where you measure their performance in a different situation or scenario. So like I said, the pre-test must be the same as the post-test. If you're using those data for any kind of research, then even more importantly, you have to make sure that the pre and post tests are the same. I'm not sure that's extremely relevant for us, but if you were moving on to do some kind of using your data that in your assessment for some kind of research, then that would be an important control variable. But I'm not suggesting by any means that pre and post test data should be the only thing you're collecting as part of your assessment plan. You will see as we move through this course that an assessment plan should include a variety of assessments, both formal, informal, summative and formative, traditional and authentic, and you'll actually make an assessment plan. So there's lots of things that go into assessment plans. So you may or may not be familiar with the national standards in physical education. They're produced by NASB, and they tell us what the outcomes of good physical education programs should be. Each state took these national standards to produce their own standards. In North Carolina, those are known as the essential standards. So, if we look at the question, should our assessment be based on our national standards? Obviously, I'm leading you there. Of course they should be based on our national standards. Or maybe not so much based, but they should be aligned somehow. You should be able to say that everything you teach, everything you assessed, has something to do with one of these 5 standards on this slide. And you can see that Standard 1 deals with motor skills and movement patterns. Standard 2 with concept, principles, strategies, tactics. Standard 3 deals with physical fitness. Standard 4 is personal and social behavior. And Standard 5 is value in physical activity. So these are the 5 big standards or goals of physical education. So everything we teach, and it's pretty easy to do, if you're any kind of movement skills or sports, goes probably into 1 and 2. If you're doing fitness activities, into 3. And then anything on the affective domain, probably into 4 and 5. More relevant, which we'll touch on module whatever later on, is looking at the state essential standards and how we have to use those in planning and assessment. So let's look at the effect on teaching when standards are used. If we're using the essential standards or the national standards, we should begin by identifying what students should know and be able to do. Then have students work to meet clearly defined and acknowledged standards or goals. We should inform students about the criteria of evaluation. We should let assessment and instruction work together. We should try to connect assessment with real-world tasks. We should attempt to identify an audience outside the realm of the school and use evaluation to assess stability in areas of application and higher level thinking skills. So that's a little bit wordy for this early in the course, but I think the point here is that there are standards out there. I just gave you the 5 national standards, and there's essential standards produced by the state. We should refer to those as we're designing assessments, because those assessments should allow us to say whether students are meeting those standards or not. Typical assessment, the plan might be to select an activity or a sport, such as badminton, determine our goals, student learning outcomes, decide what we're going to teach, the activities within each class, and then to assess, and then to move to the next unit. And I don't think there's anything that wrong with that process. It's the basic planning, teaching, assessment process. However, there's no cycling back round from the assessment back into the planning stage. Standards-based assessment, the first thing we do is select a target or a goal, which may be selected for you, and they are in the North Carolina Essential Standards. Define the standards and the indicators that we're trying to align our instruction to. Decide how you're going to do that, and then assess to see if the students have met those standards. You have to do that by using some kind of rubric, and a lot of the rubrics are pre-produced for you. And then continue to teach the activity, and then practice continuous assessment and instruction to reach the target or the goal. So there's a need to change the type of assessments used in health and physical education. And if we think of maybe some teachers, not all teachers, but some teachers just don't assess. And perhaps their principals aren't currently enforcing that, so there's no need to do it if it's not being enforced. However, I would say to you that in the interviewing process for sure, and then also in your teaching jobs, Eventually you're going to work for someone or in a school district that holds you as a teacher accountable for the assessments. And it's something that we do in our program at the undergraduate level. You have to show demonstrated competence in being able to assess student learning. So we know that some don't assess, they just determine grades by attendance, dressing out, and effort, which is problematic across the board. It would be the same thing as grading students in a math class by whether they're sat at a desk with a book in front of them with clothes on. Obviously, in math class, you get assessed based on how you learn, and that should be the same for us too. Attendance, dressing out, and effort has no measure of learning in there whatsoever. Written tests are okay, but typically they don't measure students' higher order thinking ability or the ability to apply content to real world situations. Fitness tests are usually administered once or twice a year, and then nothing is done with the data. That should not be a part of the student's grade unless it's built into some kind of project where students set goals, come up with a plan, and implement that plan. Skills tests, again, they can be okay, but there's several problems. They're very time consuming, and they don't tell us whether students can apply those skills to the game. I think of that movie Clueless with Alicia Silverstone when she stood in a long line waiting to come up and hit the tennis ball twice and then go back to the back of the line, and the teacher's doing the skills test. So most skills tests are done inappropriately with lots of students waiting in turn on public display, and they're not applied to the real game. So maybe a better assessment for tennis is to have the students actually playing a game of doubles or singles, and the teacher to be walking around and assessing the students' performance as they're playing, using a rubric. That's an example of how you combine assessment with instruction and you don't lose physical activity time. So to conclude, if physical education is to survive, one of the things that has to happen is that teachers and students must be held more accountable. How can we do that? Well, proper assessment can be part of that answer. And proper assessment is the focus of this course, and how we deliver the type of instruction and the type of assessment that will be needed will be the focus of the future modules in this course. Here's the references from those first few slides. You can see that many of them focus on advocacy issues and whether we should be assessing within our profession. What I'd like you to do in follow-up to this lecture is, in the chapter there's a case study presented on page 8 where they present this case study of Mr. Thomas. I would like you to answer these questions on the discussion board that I'm going to create for Module 1, and you can just take all of these questions, 1, 2, 3, 4, 7 of them, and copy and paste those into the discussion board and then answer each one underneath them. So I need to see the question and then your response to these 7 questions on that discussion board. And I want you to do it on the discussion board because I want you to see what everyone else is responding. Now obviously I'm going to be pretty disappointed if you're just copying other people's responses. In fact, that would be plagiarism, so just don't do that. Read the chapter, case study, you've listened to this lecture, do the readings, the articles, and then respond to these discussion board questions. I'm looking for detailed responses, not just one sentence responses. I'm looking for detailed responses to each of these questions. It should take some time, but then again, I'm going to give you plenty of time to do this module, so you shouldn't be rushing through this. If you're rushing through this, it's going to tell me that for future modules you need less time to complete them. Additionally, there's 2 articles in this folder on Blackboard: Increasing the Value of PE, the Role of Assessment, and Maximizing Learning Through Assessment. I want you to write a reflection on both of those. They're worth 5% each of your final grade as stated in the syllabus. And go ahead and read this statement again in terms of what I expect for a reflection. Okay, I'm looking for details, and I'm not going to read all this to you, but if you follow these directions, you should be okay. So again, that's going to be time consuming, because I want you to read the article, to think critically about the article, and to write 2 good reflections. And I'll present the due dates for those on Blackboard, so please follow the directions. That concludes this lecture on Introduction to Assessment.